It's lovely to see you.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
So I've got the questions here, and probably better so we don't have to edit it too much. Right. If we talk anything that you want to maybe clarify or whatever, we do now, and then we just go into it so we don't have to edit it too much. But I've got it more or less in the format. I just, you know, the section where you weren't too happy with Baroque fashion and things like that.
Yes.
I changed the question to really something just very general for the intermediate to, you know, getting up to advanced players that get a bit overwhelmed with, you know, all the rules and regulations of appoggiaturas, links, where they come, upper notes, how you start, if the upper notes has, you know, preceded the note, do you do it again? Is, you know, is there an exception to the rule? How do you finish it? That would really help them and help teachers and help them, you know, not feel so overwhelmed, and then they feel as though maybe they can go to the next level.
Yes, it's a very, very, very good point, and it's kind of a pivotal point too, which over the years I've developed strong feelings about, really, and I don't know whether it takes me closer or further away to performance practice, but I think, have you seen the Pirates of the Caribbean?
Yes.
Did you ever see it? There's a lovely line in that. They're not so much, he says it's not so much a code as guidelines.
Yeah.
And that's what I think. I mean, this business about being hung up, let's think about it for a moment. You know, we're talking about rules for doing things, but we're talking about music, and we actually don't play music by rules, not real music. You know, real music is what, you know, and that's what I was really enjoying about your website, you know, is this this thing about the feeling of something. It was like your Moyes example, for example, of the, I can't remember his name, but it's the feeling of things as much as rules, you know. I mean, Moyes plays technically beautifully, you know, everything, but I actually thought your version, when you played it, had more feeling in it than Moyes.
You know? Oh, the Woodall Serenade.
The Woodall Serenade, yeah. I thought it
had... it's a beautiful piece, but I do listen to him a lot playing that.
Yes, yeah. Well, he's a very fine, you know, he was a very fine player.
So the first question I've got here is, you know, to briefly describe your career, you know, where the roots of your sound, which I would have to say just left me gobsmacked at Wild Acres when I first heard you, and, you know, your career, where your influences have come from, and how you came to be at Wild Acres. Maybe if you could start with that for us.
Yes, the Wild Acres question, or the other one?
No, well, let's start with maybe your background, you know, to who you studied with, you know, the major influences in your life, that why you chose Baroque flute. Well, you know, you have an amazing sound on.
Okay. Well, let's start. I mean, if we start from where I went to music college, I actually ended up at music college with the last teacher I wanted to be with. I won't mention his name. I actually went to study with Geoffrey Gilbert, and I was with this other teacher for a couple of years. And I have to say I was on the verge of giving up and leaving college when they swapped me over. So I swapped over to Geoffrey Gilbert, who taught.
Oh, you lucky person.
Yeah, I was very lucky. Partly, not just for the flute teaching, but Geoffrey was one of the most wonderful teachers I think I've learned in any, studied with in any field. He was just a brilliant teacher was which is extraordinary when you think he was a natural player, you know. I mean, I think he was playing professionally at some ridiculously young age in his early teens. Anyway, so really the roots of everything started at college, at the Guildhall. My formative sounds, if you like. I have to say, one of the brilliant things about Geoffrey is he never imposed anything on you. He worked with you, and you know Geoffrey players like Wibb and Trevor White. They don't all sound alike. They don't all sound like Geoffrey did. Nobody sounded like Geoffrey did, you know. And Galway studied with him too, as far as for a while. Anyway, the main influences, yes, Moyes. I mean, Moyes was hugely in the air in England at the time, I would say. And the other one for me was Rampal. And I mean, I still think Rampal was an amazing, well, I think he was an amazing musician in many ways. He wasn't always, but at his best, he was brilliant. And I think what's often overlooked, say, about Rampal is that Rampal clearly had read books like Quantz. Rampal was aware of stylistic information and applied it. So they were my two main influences. I mean, I had a lot of old Moyes 78s, and you know, those where you've heard them, the lovely recordings he made of doing his own studies, which are very revealing because he doesn't stick to the metronome marks and he takes breaths all over the place, you know.
Yes.
In a very good way, you know. They're far more useful, in fact, than his books are. So they were the main influences. Now, the other critical thing that happened when I was at Guildhall, my best friend, who was a cellist and the son of a man who was very famous in England at the time, a man called William Pleath, who taught Jacqueline du Pré and played in the Allegri String Quartet. This friend of mine, we got together. In fact, we used to play guitar together and do that kind of thing. But he also had a friend at the Royal College of Music who was a harpsichordist and organist, and Trevor Pinnock. And so we formed this trio. And in fact, we were working professionally before we left college. This wasn't on Baroque flute. This was on, you know, this was just modern flute. In fact, I didn't even like the Baroque flute. What I'd read and heard of it was pretty ghastly, I thought, you know. I mean, one collector of instruments, he wrote, as far as I remember, that they were fit for little more than firewood. You wouldn't get much of a fire out of a Baroque flute. Anyway, so we left college and carried on. And then one tour we were doing, we stayed with a man who had an 18th century flute. And he gave it to me to try, and he lent it to me. And that changed my whole opinion of the instrument. Wow. And at the time, I lived near a very big instrument, but possibly at the time, that one of the biggest collections of old flutes in England. And I used to go there and play on the instruments. I wasn't playing it professionally. I started learning by myself. I started teaching myself from books and going to the museum. And after about a year, the museum curator said to me, "Oh, would I like to do a tour playing old flutes?" Because she, excuse me, she and a lady from the Paris Conservatoire collection of instruments were mounting an exhibition which was going to tour in France and England. And so she offered me a year's worth of work playing.
Wow, that was a good start.
So, but by this time, the trio itself had folded up. So I asked Trevor Pinnock if he'd like to play with me as the harpsichordist. And the lady who ran the collection in Paris, she got Geordie Saval. So for a year, we toured as a trio, Geordie, Saval, Trevor and me playing. And that was my beginning, playing Baroque music. And then the first recording I made was a Bach flute sonatas with Trevor and Geordie again. So, like so many things that have happened in my career, it was chance, really. You know, it wasn't cunning. I didn't have a cunning plan. If only I could have cunning plans, but it was.
If only we could all have cunning plans.
Exactly. And so that's how it happened. Yes, I just
Wow.
got, yeah. I mean, what really interested me was one of the things, I don't know what it was like when you learned, but we used to be taught that there was a way of playing Mozart and a way of doing this, you know, and a way of doing that, and they all had their style. And I wasn't happy with that. And when I played with the trio, with Trevor and Tony Pleath, what we did try to do, although we were playing modern instruments, was that we did look at style. And of course, Trevor, being the harpsichordist, was the leader in that, if you like. He was the one who had to engage with it because he wasn't playing a modern keyboard, you know, he wasn't playing a piano. Yes. So that was an influence. So if you like, it wasn't just the chance events were more than one. The circumstances were right in all ways for me to learn it. And so I found myself, and I think I'm right in saying that I was the first professionally trained, I suppose, orchestral player, as most of flute playing training was then, to play, to play historical flutes professionally, or perhaps any, in England, that is, in the UK, yeah. Obviously not in Europe. I mean, they were way ahead of us. So that's how it started. Anyway, that's how it started.
Fascinating.
I'll tell you something, Eileen, that we went through a period, I mean, we flute players, when head joints were pretty awful, most of them. You know, they started enlarging them, making the sound bigger, but it wasn't more refined and it wasn't more responsive. No. Yes. And Eldred, very gifted man, he made me this, and it was a copy of an old French head. It was after an old French head, you see, and he made it for me because I needed something, because I was playing Baroque flute so much of the time. I needed something more responsive, you know, more flexible. I didn't need a great big sound. I needed quality of sound and the control over it. Yeah. So that's what it was.
But you've certainly got quality of sound. So tell I'm sure the players would be really interested. Tell them how you landed up at Wildacres, how long you've been there and where it is, and maybe a bit about what Wildacres is about.
Well, Wildacres is in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. It's a beautiful place, which was started extraordinarily. The roots of it were in the man who started it first there. Didn't start Wildacres, but built the place. Actually invented gunk, I think.
Oh,
yeah. Anyway, but I believe, and I was just thinking about how I ended up there, because and the reason, the way I ended up there was, I think, because of Trevor Y. I think Trevor Y got me over there originally.
Ah.
Trevor taught there for a few years. It was somewhere, and I hate to say this because I've been having a problem about this. It was almost 40 years ago.
Ah, so you've been doing it a long time.
Yeah, so
well, it's 20 years since I was there, you know, so yes. When I first met you.
Yeah, it is. It's a long time. Yeah. But it's a beautiful place, and it's run, originally it was just the flute players, of course, just flute players, and then later on, and I don't remember why, I think Wildacres management themselves wanted some variety, and they had some problems with accommodating another course, and so there are saxophones go there as well. And I don't know, I know a lot of wind players can be very snooty about sax players, but my experience with them has always been very positive, because the best of them have very open minds, and unlike any classical wind instrument player, they don't come in to the profession with a whole set of assumptions. They just get on with the music and you know, investigating how they do it. So I've had a very good association. Well, even at Guildhall, when I was teaching there, I had some very good sax students. You know, I'm teaching coaching, obviously, you know, interpretation, not sax. But
Yes.
I think it makes the atmosphere very positive, because it's not exclusively fluty, and also saxophone players are such different, you know, they're not like any of us classical players. Each you know, oboist, clarinetist, flute players, all defined by their separate little quirky behaviors. And so I mean, it's a lovely atmosphere there, you know, it's a lovely atmosphere. And the person who runs it now, Anna Thibault, is excellent. She's brilliant. She has a long history as a flute player and an organizer and an educator, and she's wonderful. You know, it's a wonderful place, great variety. Yes, I could highly recommend it, even if you just like going to beautiful places. I have to say, and I don't want to use up our precious time, but I was there one year. We had an early Wild Acres and there was an eclipse there. And it wasn't a total eclipse, but it was the most amazing. The sky turned a kind of dark purple, and because of all the trees around, because we're surrounded in trees and mountains, there were these most extraordinary shadows, and over the ground were all these little shadows, like crescent moons, presumably as the crescent of the sun shadows. I don't know.
Wow, eerie.
It was eerie. It was very eerie, and it was easy to imagine how in the past people could have been so superstitious about about it. But wonderful place, lovely place.
So what would you say here? I've got a question. What would you say did you have a goal of over all those years of, you know, what you wanted to achieve there with the style and the interpretation, or did it just change every year, or was there a particular message that you wanted to impart?
That's interesting. I've never thought about it, but thinking about it now, yes, there were several things that changed. I think the first thing is what we were saying about early music. You know, originally I set out again, if you like, with the banner. This is how this is how it's done banner. This is what you do. And the other banner, which I feel in a way more ashamed of, is the masterclass teaching style. And that style that you entertain people, often, I would say, particularly with old-fashioned masterclass teaching, rather unethically, you know, like taking somebody and turning them into an amusement for the class and things like that. And a lot of it was for me was learning how to treat people, how to try to make how to make an interesting masterclass. Although I have to say I have a real problem with, I shouldn't say that. How to teach people and how to work with them rather than just teach at them, you know, and use, if you like, for entertainment. I mean, it was one thing that Moyes was notorious for, was his bad treatment, particularly of female players in the class. And I didn't. It was something I didn't approve of, but also as this thing that gradually occurred to me. Why it should occur so slowly, I don't know. But that, you know, if a Böhm flute player wants to learn about the music and how to play it, that they need to be put in a situation, particularly with, just a few classes, where they have some control themselves over what they do and they don't need to be told all the time. And I think, I came to think, and I still think very strongly, that fundamental control is your own feeling, your own musical feeling. You know, how do you learn to do something, say a trill with an upper note start, if you simply regard it as a thing to do? you know, and an appoggiatura, it's a thing you do. It's just a thing. You don't relate, you're not taught it musically as something, well, it only works if your application is a musical one, you know, if it's informed. It's like we learn to play a piece and we struggle over it because of the ornaments, but underneath all those ornaments is a simple, often in Baroque music, a simple melodic shape. We should learn the melody first and then find out what the ornaments are doing, rather than strangling the ornament, strangling the melody and the meaning of the music with ornaments that we actually have trouble playing, you know.
Yes.
And of course, a keyed flute, in many ways, a Böhm flute, makes ornaments harder because you've got, you know, with wonderful modern keys and keypads, the movement is so, you know, so precise. It actually can make it harder, not easier. You know, and so I think for me the most important thing is why are you doing it musically?
Right.
You know? And if it's not musical, and I have no problem with learning a rule. I don't see anything wrong with that, but don't mistake the rule for the music.
Yes. I think that's a really good point.
But that's my impression, but that was my impression from your website in the first place, is what I particularly liked about it. I mean, I love what you write about the pieces too. I think it's very helpful, and particularly when you're able to put in the you know, examples, recorded examples from YouTube. I think that's really good, and I think that's so good. And what you say about Moyes too is interesting, because going back to his recordings, what his recordings really teach you is that it's one thing on paper and it's another thing when you're actually working on those pieces, you know.
Yes.
I mean, I still use I adapt exercises, you know, and I use the Moyes books. Right now I've been going through his articulation book again.
Yeah.
You know,
I don't think you ever get sick of any of his books, do you? You kind of like recycle them.
Well, yeah, and if you take Moyes' ethic, he never says it, but it does appear again in his recordings, you know, is that what you realise, you can adapt these. Don't approach them as if they're set in stone. You know, You're not set in stone. You need to find out what your weaknesses are and how to use them. Otherwise, you're just creating yet another, you know, another rod to beat your own back with, you know, and the point is to move you forward, not
yes.
You know. So yes, actually there's another book. Oh, can I remember his name? Can't remember his name offhand, sorry. I'll have to send it to you. There's an American, he's an old man now, wonderful old man, who was mostly a piccolo player, Wilfred Kajala. And he wrote a book called The Flutist Vade Mecum. I'll send you the details of that, because I think it's a fantastic book in a totally different way to anybody else it's teaching. It's not a high-powered book, but like Moyes, a lot of it gets to the root of things. Yes. I'll try and send you an email copy of that, and I don't know what you can see of it online. If maybe I'll see if I can photograph a few pages so you can form a choice without spending.
No, I don't mind. I'm always interested. I've got a very open mind. I'm always interested in getting information, because knowledge is power. So so we've covered Wildacres. What would be your general kind of thing? And maybe this is the time where we bring in, you know, the amazing dancers and that we did at Wildacres. So what would be your general advice to players about tempos, choosing tempos? Because, you know, from what I can see, there's a fine line between, you know, elegance and madness with Baroque music. You know, you just take it just that little bit too fast, and you lose the musicality and the elegance. And what I find is, relating it to the dance steps and body movement, it's the same with the vocal. It has its own tempo, and it has its own, you know, momentum. So is there a kind of like a general thing with tempos, or?
That is really tricky, because tricky to, it's, gosh, it's not. Obviously there's a certain speed at which a body can move. And also, and this is worth remembering, and I think it's lovely to hear you saying what you say, that remembering the body can't do anything as abruptly as we can, you know, with tiny, you know, we can start and finish it. And I think that's a really important movement, a really important point, but it doesn't tell you about tempo. To a certain extent, you can think that, well, dance like music, you know, there are dancers that are very technically capable and can do things much more quickly, and also, which we tend not to think of, in the 17th, 18th century, it was perfectly clear that some of the finer points of dancing were actually seen in very slow dancing, a great deal of control, you know, because the ideal dancer in those days was a male dancer, a noble male dancer who had total control over themselves. So slowness was important, and as we know, playing slowly can be really, really difficult, because it's so easy for everything to fall apart. I think there is one important thing again that we do with tempo. We're taught that there's a right speed, aren't we? You know, by our teachers, and they say, oh well, that's you play at that speed, or it's too fast, or it's too slow. But you think of how many pieces of music, famous classic, you know, classical standard pieces, are played at exactly the same tempo. There are few where everybody all seems to play them the same speed. But everything else becomes a question of, what do you think about this piece? You know, what do I think about it? If my interpretation of it's exciting, then, and I can make you feel that, and so the speed is part of the excitement, then it's part of the music. But if I simply say to myself, oh, it's marked presto, I'm going to play it as fast as I can, it's nothing to do with music. It's simply an idea in my head, you know. And again, tempo becomes detached from musical expression.
I think that's the answer I was looking for.
Sorry, it was very long. I am long-winded. If you want to shut me up,
no, that was definitely the answer I was looking for, you know, because there does seem to be kind of like a focus on playing studies as fast as you can, and Paganini, you know, and all of this, and as fast as you can go and fast as your fingers. But just because it's a study, it doesn't make musical sense. And so, you know, I think even with studies and tempos and things like that, I suppose it's getting to the root of it all, that basically every note needs to have some meaning and some musical expression, and you know, it all adds up. So the music's got to speak, and that,
well, it's like your melodious studies, you know, the Moy's melodious studies, the way he, you know, they clearly studies, he focuses on certain aspects, and he breathes every 2 bars or something in some of them, you know. And you can hear him he nourishes the piece, if you like. He doesn't simply go through it like a solid old exercise, you know, like a lump of ice. And I think that's true of everything. But we're not taught, how can tempo be separate from expression, what we feel about a piece, you know? I mean, certainly with a lot of Baroque music, what I've found, or what I believe, is there's an awful, like in Bach particularly, there's an awful lot of melody in it, and we're playing semiquavers. You call them semiquavers in Australia, don't you?
Yes, we do.
You do, yeah. Not. I seem to, you know, we play for all these semiquavers and rattle through them, and actually underneath, Bach being Bach, there are these beautiful lines underneath, and another expression, and we lose that expression because we think, oh, it's fast, you know, let's
off we go.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts on, I suppose, romantic interpretation of Baroque music, where the player may want to, you know, be a little more expressive and effusive with their expression, you know, bringing that romantic approach into Baroque music?
It's an interesting choice of word, romantic, because I know what you mean. And as far as being more effusive, yes, I'm sure they did. I mean, there are a few sources. I hate to mention the word sources, but at least two which mention slowing down when the music went and speeding up. And of course, we are so, if you like, crippled. In some ways, we're cripples. We've had what, nearly, well, certainly 150 years of recorded music. If you think that, I mean, as we know, that once upon a time people would hear music, that performance once, they'd never hear it again. They wouldn't be able to pick it to pieces. All they'd know is whether they enjoyed it, appreciated it, or disliked it. And I think, yes, I used to think of Baroque music as Sunday afternoon music on the radio, and because it was like TikTok. And as far as I can tell, and this is the interesting thing about rhythm too, that rhythm is not the same as metronomicity. You know, it's not the same thing at all, and we know that. And so I think, yes, I think if you think of it as romantic, I don't like the word, but not because I don't like the word romantic, but I think we're expressive creatures. You think of the lovely tunes in some Baroque music. You know, Ludda Drummond. You know Ludda Drummond.
Yes.
Such a pretty tune. I mean,
that's gorgeous,
isn't it? So those people who wrote, the person who wrote that tune, they've and they would have felt the same as we did. I mean, they were people with emotions. They expressed them differently. You know, there was a different culture. I think it was not until the late 18th century that people started to get self-indulgent, but at the same time, the same emotions were there, weren't they? You know, sadness, happiness. I mean, yes. And if you can't express that feeling in the music, I think you kill it, really, don't you? And the worst thing is you kill it for yourself. You know, if we don't enjoy music making, however good we are, how can we convey our music to people who listen to it? You know, if we don't feel it, why should anybody else?
Yes.
And also, you know, I think it's terribly important to us, and it may seem a bit extreme, but I think the expressive value of what we do is lost too easily in the technical value of what we can achieve. And of course, technique is only to allow us, is to give us the means to play the music better. That's all. And you know, and and I think that's what I enjoyed about Rampal. That Rampal, you know, you know what I mean about, you know.
Yes, I do. I listen to a lot of Rampal. I think he's a wonderful musician. You know, I think there were some years where he was a bit over the top. You know, his vibrato, I think.
Absolutely.
But I do think he's a wonderful musician, and I do listen to quite a bit of Rampal. I like him. Yeah,
and you're absolutely right. And actually, I think it's important we can say so, that Rampal did some awful things too. You know, I mean, I went to a concert of Vivaldi concertos, which he played like a pig, but the audience, the audience loved it. But he did the most beautiful encore. He took a Haydn violin concerto, slow movement, and the audience didn't appreciate it nearly as much. But that's when he played most musically. You know.
Yes.
You know. But I think we should be able to criticise. There's no reason. Rampal did some things badly, but what he did well, he did so well, you know.
Yes. I was wondering if maybe you could tell the players how you got in. You've got a dance group, haven't you? How you got involved with Baroque dance and the dance group, and how that came about, and you know what your thoughts were.
Well, when I was teaching at the Guildhall, there was another teacher who taught Baroque dance, and I went to her classes because I was interested in dance. Also, something that had always stuck in my mind was Stravinsky said that there were only two forms. I think it's so long since I've quoted this. That I think he said basically that all music is dance music, or all Baroque music was dance music. It was a very perceptive remark. I wish I could find it actually. I mean, the truth is that it was either dance or ecclesiastical. I think it was either dance or song. And I was aware of that in Baroque dance. And what happened? Yes, so I learned to dance, and I was interested. But then I was asked years later to play B minor, the Bach's B minor suite, and it was going to be choreographed. And I have to say, I was fairly pissed off about it. But when it happened, I was really interested, and I decided that it was actually very interesting. So I decided to, originally I decided to put on a concert with dancers and get somebody to choreograph it for me. And I couldn't find the person I wanted, couldn't do it. And so I thought, I gave up that idea for a while, and I taught myself to read Baroque dance notation. And then my wife, she wasn't my wife then, but she was a dancer, and I used her to teach the dancers. So I taught her, and she taught the dancers how to dance, and that's how it started. Really, was simply because I couldn't get the person I wanted to do the choreography. So I went back to original 18th century choreography, learnt it myself, and then taught the much as I'd done with the flute, really. And taught it that way. What I learned over the years were interesting things to me was, well, what we were saying about rhythm, that rhythm is not metronomic, it's about flow. And, that's why the body is so important in music, in all music, unless it's deliberately not corporeal, if you like, that we make a movement and we can't, there's no way we can suddenly do a movement. Well, there is, but it still takes time. Whereas when we play an instrument, that physicality is so easy to lose, Yes. That flow of a start, a middle, and a beginning. I learned actually from a saxophone player on the Wild Acres course. I noticed with dancers that they could be very musical, but still move at different times. And what I realized is that some dancers will start to move slightly before the beat, so they end in the middle of it. And some will start to move on the beat, absolutely on the front of the beat. And I learned from one of the saxophone players that that's exactly I think happens in jazz, that you think about a front of a beat, a middle of a beat, the back of a beat, and it's something that good classical players do, but we're not taught it. We're taught as if, just like with tuning, there's the right place and everywhere else is wrong. It's just like, if you like, you were asking about Baroque rules. It's like there's a right rule and everything else is wrong. I mean, and so the importance of dance for me, apart from the sheer pleasure of it, was how it taught me about how music moves. Music moves. It's not dimensionless, not just a sound, not just a one-dimensional sound in space. A note has a front, a middle, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as you know, as a teacher, you often talk about playing before a note starts, even, you before you even play a note. Yes. And how rests are not simply places of silence where we don't play. They are also places that carry rhythm, and depending on how we go into that rest will affect the rest. And the same with breathing. We talk about the right and wrong places to breathe, but actually the right and wrong places to breathe are the places that sound right and wrong. And when you listen to them, they either make sense or they don't make sense.
That makes sense, yes.
you know, and it's to do with the way we flow into them and out of them. Whereas sadly, when we're taught that, well, this is the right place to breathe, and yet we can't work out, or this is my memory of why when we do it, it doesn't sound right, whereas when our teacher does it, it does, you know. And we
yeah. Well, I have similar thoughts about breathing as well. Yeah.
So it all comes back to the same thing. So yeah, so with the dance, unfortunately, I don't do it now since I've moved up to Scotland. In fact, I haven't done any, but I hadn't done any for some years because it gets, you know, it's so time consuming and so money consuming, and nobody wants to pay the kind of money. You'd have to get huge audiences, you know, to make it work financially. Yeah. Stop.
No, I was just fascinated. I think it was, you know, a real highlight for me, apart from your classes on style and sound and that, the Baroque dancing was a highlight for me at Wildacres when I first, you know, I hadn't even thought about body movement and flow and all of that kind of thing. It just makes Baroque music a lot easier, I think, to understand, and a lot easier to grasp a tempo. If you think, well, you know, how would you move, or what would the feet be doing, and you know, literally how fast can you do it? I don't. As you say.
Yeah, and there's another important thing which is problematic when you simply say it, but is the importance of rhythm. You know, I mean, Baroque dance steps always start on the downbeat. So the foot always goes down on the downbeat. Now that's very crude, because I used to think, oh, well, all you need to do, and we used to do this, in fact, early on in our pioneering days, was just to emphasize every downbeat. But in fact, of course, you've got to phrase what's happened.
Oh, I can still see you. Can you see me?
I don't know what my computer's doing. I'm just going to try. Let me see. No, I can't.
I can hear you. Can you see me?
No, I can't. I don't know what my computer's done.
Oh, I might have to just go and get Keith.
No, it's not Keith's. It's not your. Oh, I can't see you. That's it. But it doesn't. I can hear you. So.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, I can see you, and I think we're still recording.
Good. As long as it's all right, then I don't understand what's happened. I think I'm inclined not to play around with it, actually, because we've still got. As long as we can hear each other, we can carry on, can't we? So that's fine.
I should imagine I'm not. Keith's disappeared, probably down to his bonsais. But I'm not a technical person, but I can see me and I can see you.
Okay, well that's fine. I don't know what my computer's done. It is something my computer's done, and I don't know why it's done it. But there we go. Let's go on. Let's go on, Eileen.
Okay, so for students, do you have any practicing tips of how you would approach, say, for example, a Bach sonata with practicing it? Are there any kind of helpful steps that you could give players to approach a Bach sonata?
Right. Let's get my. You know, funnily enough, I think one of the first things is I start to look for melody, if I can. I tend, and this is easier said than done, but I tend to strip it down to basic movement. I mean, if we take the first movement of the E minor Bach sonata and we look at the first bar, there is no flute note on a strong beat of that bar. And we've got, if you like, two lines. We've got an upper line, which is almost totally syncopated, da dee, the B to the C. And then we have the lower line. So I start to take it to pieces like that. I have to say, harder to talk about than to demonstrate. Rhythm is always important to me. I make sure that I don't emphasize or play notes equally. And this is very hard for a bone flute player, because we play instruments that are designed to be equal, and to learn to play them with more inflection, while in theory we find perfectly natural, in training, of course, we're taught the exact opposite, you know, to equalize registers, to equalize notes. And that's perfectly a reasonable aim, because we've spent 2 or more centuries working on that approach. But it needs flexibility all the time. I mean, I'm just trying to think of a better example than an easier example than the E minor.
What about the C major?
The C major, yes. If we took the opening of the C major,
yeah,
I just take initially, I think, the basic movement, which is the first of each group of 16ths, and see what melodic shape it gives me. Now, this usually doesn't work for many bars, because as a piece develops, it becomes more complex. But it's a start, and that does remind me, I think, of something very useful, is to look through the entire piece, because as we know, there's some bits we find easy to see, and we think, I know what that means. I know, you know, I feel musically what that means. And then there might be a lot of other places where we don't. And it's good if we can start with a point of connection, because it makes us feel more confident, and it makes me feel, certainly, if this piece, say, underneath all these semiquavers, is a rather touching melody, as in the E major second movement, then I'm missing something if I'm just belting through it or not understanding it. This must, being Bach, the whole piece must be permeated with this feeling, you know, with variations of this feeling. And so I look for outlines and melodic outlines, and ones that ideally move by step or by very simple harmonic movement, very basic harmonic movement. I look for bass lines. What we forget is that an awful lot of Baroque music, well, we don't forget, we're not taught, we don't know, that it's much more contrapuntal. You know, we're taught that the beginning of the Baroque era, they started to treat music harmonically rather than contrapuntally, and that was the big change. But in fact, so much Baroque music, you'll find even in the simplest, that there are 2 lines. There's an upper line and a lower line, and the complexity is simply created by the way the composer has woven those 2 lines together. I mean, the Telemann fantasies are a brilliant example of that. I mean, I think they're absolutely genius. They are so simple, and yet they are made because they are simple, and yet somehow he's made a complexity out of very simple materials. And it's because Telemann sometimes has 2 lines and sometimes even briefly 3 lines. Sorry, does any of that make sense?
It makes complete sense. I think I wanted to ask you about is that over your career, I noticed, especially when you stayed with us in Sydney, I couldn't imagine how somebody could spend so long on whistle tones, but because you've got such a gorgeous sound, I said to Keith, that would drive me nuts. You know, I'd have to play a note. So I was wondering if maybe you had some insight into, you know, because I'm a big whistle tone fan as well, into whistle tones, why you like them, how they're beneficial, and also birdsong. You know, if there's any insights that you could give players into that.
Well, whistle tones, well, you know this, all it is about using your lips. It's very easy for us to overdo, you know, to overdo our lips, isn't it? You know, to get too much tension to the embouchure. And really that's it. I mean, rather sadly, I suppose, I rather like the sound of whistle tones too.
Well, it's quite a challenge to get them to sound beautiful, isn't it?
It certainly is. I mean, actually, although I don't think it's a great book, but a book was compiled in America of Jeffrey Gilbert's Jeffrey, is it Jeffrey's or one of Trevor Wise? No, I think Jeffrey, where he says he doesn't do whistle tones, but he doesn't dismiss them either. You know, he says if they're helpful, do them. And I think particularly if you're having trouble with rigidity, that whistle tones can be helpful. But in a way, funnily enough, it's an interesting that you link that question to the birdsong question, because part of me, I'm just interested in sound. I mean, since we last met in Sydney, I did a PhD and I did it on birdsong and improvisation. And what I became, and I formed a group which was an electroacoustic group, and it was all improvisation, in fact. And I became more and more interested in how, as musical. In fact, I was interested in this, working on this when I was with you in Sydney.
Yes.
Yes, of course. Was how musical feeling in us is partly a physical thing, you know. So with the birdsong, it was partly the impulse of birdsong. I can't think of an Australian bird. I mean, an English bird, a European bird, the European robin. I mean, it has these outbursts of songs, and you can hear when it's singing kind of contentedly, just mapping out its territory, and where it's actually agitated, and it's just like us. You can hear an intensity, and what my birdsong, as you know, was what I was interested in, was the way we produce, how I can produce sound and my physical feelings by a different way of fingering, and by bursts of sound, and by different colours of sound, and rather than worrying about, you know, this is a good tone, that's a bad tone, about the way our different fingerings on any instrument can, they're just different colours, you know. Okay, we have good tones and bad tones in classical playing, but actually in music, if you like, just as an open field, that is entirely open. We choose what sounds we like, you know, like in Aboriginal music. I mean, who would think a didgeridoo, you know, could produce such, well, to my mind, such musical effect. Even the sticks, I don't know what they're called, but I got a lovely pair, in fact, of sticks, you know. And it's those things that expressing ourselves in sound, classical training can destroy that, I think. And of course, we have to play in a way that works for the music we choose to do. But something that always strikes me is that when Stravinsky first wrote Rite of Spring, and he has that da-dee-da-da-dee-da, that apparently the way they played the bassoon then it was actually a strangled sound, not that lovely tenor sound that everybody, you know, every bassoonist plays when they play the bassoon solo in Rite of Spring. And it's like it's corrupted. Not corrupted. That's not, you know what I mean. I know you do.
I do. Yes, I do know what you mean.
I mean, I did a dance project on Kurt Weill, and I listened to the original recordings. And I have to say, I found Kurt Weill, the music, so much more enjoyable in the original recordings than a lot of the later ones, you know, the 20th century, 21st century, because they're so smooth sounding and they've lost that kind of edge to them. You know, you listen to an old Threepenny Opera recording from the period, and it has a real edge to it, you know.
Yes.
But anyway, you know what I mean. And so
I do know what you mean.
You know. So that's why the birdsong was in a way to liberate me, but also it took me to new places, which I got to with great difficulty, I have to say, because I realized that I had very strong ideas about right ways and wrong ways to do things. And maybe that was one of the biggest things that taught me about music in people. I mean, it was when I was working actually in Australia and New Zealand, working with groups who were what we rather badly call non-musicians, and working with them with the birdsong ideas, that I realized that how fundamental musical expression is to us, and that so many people are deprived of it because what we call music has such a high level of sophistication that they can't join in technical sophistication, and it makes it very difficult, you know, for them. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. And I think people will find it very interesting. So I just have one last question for you, if you've got enough time.
Yes.
And, you know, the big work that gets me thinking all the time as well is the solo sonata in A minor, the JS bar.
Yes, yeah, me too. Yeah.
So just, I wonder if we could just briefly talk about each movement. And, you know, I think you probably would say the same as you said before about the skeleton structure and the melody, the beautiful melody that's there in the Allemande. But I'm just wondering, for example, you know, I have a lot of different ideas and I can never make up my mind about the slurring patterns. So for the Allemande.
Yeah.
Because there are a number of different ways you can do it, and you know, do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
So, and for me, it's a really interesting thing when I'm practicing it. I know where it's going musically, but I'm just wondering, and I'm sure there are many players, you know, with the same consternation as me. How do you approach that? The slurring stylistically in the Allemande? What is a good starting point?
I have to say my answer is totally unhelpful. That I've still avoided it because I'm still. I think you know, you put your finger on something when you say there are so many different ways, and that is what makes the that Allemande so difficult, isn't it? Is that there are so many different ways you can approach it. I mean, yes. My current way, and this may horrify you, but is in pairs of notes. But I realize, so if, for example, da dee da dee da dee da da. In other words, we can have a little dialogue between those two notes. Well, that's fine for the first bar. But then the next bar, you can't really do that because it starts to get too broken up. In the first bar, it makes sense, and you can gradually scale these up. So what I've been thinking about, and actually it was your question that got me thinking more about this, was, is there a way of relating the different note groupings so that they all connect? I have to say I've been reading about a lot of, well, not a lot, and I have to say at a very popular level, no grand ideas, no mathematics or anything, a lot about very fundamental physics and the way the, existence is put together, where it all stems from. And so it's coming back to this idea of a tiny unit which always works, and it increases in complexity. This doesn't answer your question. So the question,
I think I know what you mean, though.
Yeah. So what I'm working towards, Eileen, is if I can make this work, then I may be able to answer your slurring question, because then I'd know what I was trying to slur. And I think that's my big problem sometimes, that I think it can be slurred. And I think you're right. I think sometimes the problem is the player. Well, I've heard a chap circular breathe it, believe it or not. I still can't believe it. But of course, circular breathing does not solve the problem of phrasing. It simply cops up, doesn't it? So
well, singers don't circular breathe, do they?
No, they don't, and also they didn't in those days. I mean, if anything, they breathed a lot more. And the French, who certainly seem to have been the finest flute players, they breathed the most of all. And also, if you look at it, and actually, if you listen to very early recordings, and of course, folk players, they leave notes out. You know, the German players, they'd leave notes out and breathe in the eighth
space.
Yeah. So I'm afraid I can't answer your question. I think maybe that's what's wonderful about that movement, is that we know it's an extraordinary piece of music, and yet none of us can solve it. And even say if I solved it for myself doesn't mean to say I've solved it for you.
Solved it for somebody else. No. I think you probably the more I play it, the more I think is that if I'm musically convinced and I found my way and I think I've done enough thought and I'm convinced, then, fingers crossed, it'll work.
Yeah, that's absolutely my feeling, because if you're not convinced, if all you're doing is offering them a shiny, different but the same polished flute playing, it's going to make no more sense to a listener. But if it means something to you and you're convinced, then of course, you can say something to that listener, can't you?
Yes.
And I agree. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I about teaching people, I can only tell them what I think and try to open them up as a musician for them to think for themselves, and not to say, well, Stephen Preston, he knows how it's done. No, he doesn't. I only try to find out for myself, and to help any student I have to think for themselves and find out what they do,
Yeah, and make an educated decision.
That's right. That's very important to me, more important than anything. If I can help make them a better musician, then I think I've really done something, actually,
I think that I only had 2 exposures to you in Wild Acres, but I think that came across very clearly. So one last question, and this one's for me, but I'm sure other players have the same question. So the saraband,
yes,
that's a really difficult one. It's a difficult one to choose a tempo. It's a bit like Moy's Melodious Study No. 1. Sometimes I feel as though it drags along like a funeral march, a bit like the Go Be Madrigal. So, and saraband, but then I think, so the saraband, I have the same kind of feeling, but I think there's probably a balance between dragging and then it just a little bit too fast. So there's 2 questions about the saraband. If you feel a tempo, whether it be slow or fast, is that okay, or is there not a set tempo, but is there a good tempo for that saraband? And what are your thoughts on the ornamentation? Ornamenting all the way through, or ornamenting the repeat on the second time round? Do you have any thoughts there?
Right. Well, first, I think the rhythm is the most important, and as far as my understanding, and I feel it works for me musically, is that a saraband rhythm as a dance is basically an impulse of movement, and then that movement is retained for a moment and then released. So you have 1, 2, 3, 1, and you have these movement forward, a hold, and then a release. And I think if you can get that, then your tempo is going to be rhythm based. Well, that's ideal. And then it will be more a question of whether you think it's solemn, whether you think it's just beautiful, lyrical, So whether it's da dee da dee da da dee, or it's ya da dee dee da da dee. I can feel both. But if I took the slower tempo and played it to people, the question for the people who are listening is, do I bore them with it, or can I carry them into the seriousness of it? And so that they believe in that seriousness, and they're not thinking about whether it's slow or fast. They're just hearing a piece which moves them.
Yes, and makes sense.
And funnily enough, with slurring, exactly the opposite of the allemande, it's, I think, a movement which can be slurred very easily in a number of ways without destroying it, you know, at all.
Yes, it kind of comes naturally, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, doesn't it? And you could slur it in 3 and 3, or 3, you know, 2s and 2s. I mean, really, it's extraordinary how resilient it is, the slurring.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, it's so beautiful. So do you have any thoughts, you know, just the last one, do you have any thoughts on the ornamentation? You know, often people play it all the way through with no ornamentation, and then sometimes people ornament the repeat, you know. Is there do you have any thoughts on that?
Only personally, Elaine, and that's because Eileen, because I always think if I ornament something, it's got to be an addition that's better. And I just can't. I particularly in Bach, I find it hard to, you know, to make it better. I mean, I think the allemande, the sarabande is so beautiful. I think if you could do beautiful ornamentation, I wouldn't be against it. I can't do it. I would rather want to intensify the musical feeling if I could. It doesn't, for me, need variety. I must say, some Baroque music, you think, oh God, I can't bear to hear that again, you know. But with the sarabande, it doesn't bother me. So I think if you really can do it, then you're entitled, you know, then why not? But our first thought is, what are we ornamenting? Are we ornamenting something we really understand, or are we ornamenting it just because we think, well, it's boring if we do the same thing twice?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of people will find that very helpful. So, you know, and that's probably not just so much for the sarabande, but, you know, ornamentation, if you're going to enhance it or you're going to do something, then it's got to be better than, or add value to what's there, musical value to absolutely. What's there.
Could I jump in there? I would say some of the best ornamentation of a certain sort, because as we know, there are lots of different kinds of ways of ornamenting, are the Telemann, first movement of the Telemann methodical sonatas. I mean, some of that ornamentation, it can teach you how to ornament, and it can teach you what really musical ornamentation is at the same time. And it's perfectly good for bow and flute playing. You know, you don't need to have an old stick in your hand to make it work. I do recommend them. And Bach himself, of course, I mean, the E major, the first movement of the E major Bach, perfect example of yes. Ornamentation. You know? But yeah, it's tricky for me because I've heard people who are brilliant at it. I had a student who at Guildhall a long time ago, became a very well-known flute player, but he could ornament at the drop of a hat, but musically, but the problem is he didn't understand the music, and so it all became pointless, you know. But you know, and it wasn't that it was unskilled. He was really talented, but I suppose that's another thing, is to acknowledge our limitations. And Quant says that in his book, you know, if you can't do it, then don't just play the simple tune.
And play it beautifully.
Yeah, exactly. It seems so. It does seem so obvious, doesn't it, when you say it? But we're taught.
Well, it does. But I think players will find it really helpful. You know, everything that we've discussed. You know, I think it's fantastic, because I think sometimes, especially when they're, you know, a bit more advanced than intermediate and into advanced playing, it becomes a little bit overwhelming. So if you have a basic structure to think about, it makes interpretation a lot easier, and articulation and phrasing.
Yeah, and there's another thing we always forget. You know, when I started working on my improvisation and I looked at jazz improvisation, I have to say I'd never realised that jazz players spend years working on their improvisation technique. You know, and again, Baroque players, from the period, they'd have grown up hearing it, they'd have been taught Whereas we're kind of told, oh, well, you should improvise that here, you know, this is what you do. And it's like we can just sit down and do it. And that's absurd when you come to think about it, you know.
Yes.
We're not expected to sit down and just play the flute.
Yeah.
But
takes years.
It does, yeah, yes, yeah. And I think we forget that. I was working on a student, American student, Monday, and I got her working on the Telemann fantasy. Telemann methodical sonata, first movement, because she wants to know about improvisation. I mean, and we were an hour just going through just one movement, and I don't know how much she will have got out of it, because she's a lovely player, but she's best when she plays instinctively. And I think, well, this would take you years, really, you know, to learn to do it. And I bet when you did it, once you learnt it, you do it beautifully, because she's a, you know, as I say, she's a lovely player when she plays instinctively. When she has to think about things, it screws her up a bit, as it does all of us. We can't play music by thinking. Music isn't thinking, is it? It's what we express.
A bit of a combination of the two. I found that I used to always be instinctive, but, you know, the melodious studies just changed my life. I was never the same on the other side of that book. I don't know whether it's just me, but, you know, that mixes the two, the instinct and the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's trying to learn when to switch, learning to be very thoughtful, maybe to begin with, and then to switch off thinking altogether. But what you say about the melodious studies, I think is absolutely right. I think it doesn't matter what it is. If something switches us on to a more productive, more musical way of thinking, then it's brilliant. And certainly that seems to have been Moy's genius, you know.
Yes.